Hello everyone, welcome to today's guide for my rendition of Hammer the Barbarian build. It's important to note that there are many variations of this depending on playstyle, so please feel free to tweak for your specific. Additionally, I have gained all the extra skill points available from Renown and the Altars, so you may need to change your build slightly if you don't have these. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the. Let's start with the basic skills. I chose Bash as my basic skill. It not only generates fury, but after bashing the enemies 4 times, your next bash will stun the enemy for 1.25 seconds, but it's also increased to 2 seconds if you use a two-handed weapon. So this build is built around using a two-handed bludgeoning weapon. Get into that a little later. Every fifth attack will be stunning the enemies. The modifiers I chose for this, damaging a stunned enemy with bash will grant you 20% base life as fortify, double this amount when using a two-handed weapon, and using on two-handed bludgeoning weapon. And then damaging a stunned enemy with bash generates an additional 3 fury or 4 fury. So right out the gate, just want to make sure that using a bludgeoning weapon, just so we can get our fortify and extra fury that comes with the modifiers. Moving down to the core skills, this is where Hammer of the Ancients, you'll see that I have an item that it gives me an additional 3 skill points on my Hammer of the Ancients, so it does a little more damage. So I'm at 5, I'm at 8 out of 5. And so the modifiers I have on this are gain 3% more fury for 5 seconds for each enemy damaged by Hammer of the Ancients, stacking up to 10 times. Later, when we talk about gear, why that is important. And then Hammer of the Ancients deals 1% additional damage for every point of fury you have. Again, when we talk about items and glyphs, you'll see why that is also important. Then if you go here to Endless Fury, basic skills generate 15% more fury when using a two-handed weapon. So one thing to note, the Bill Hammer of the Ancients uses a significant amount of fury. You start with max fury of 100. You'll see this costs 66. And so having this additional fury generation will allow us to build up our fury and use Hammer of the often, since it's going to be our main damage. Let's go down here to the defensive skills, starting with Rallying Cry. Basically gives movement speed and resource generation. It also impacts nearby allies, so if you play in a group, it could also help them out as well. And going to be using a really resource heavy skill, so any resource generation is going to be helpful here. Modifiers grants unstoppable while active. This is just a survivability bonus, especially when you get into the higher tier nightmare dungeons, or even when you're going from world tier 3 to world tier 3. I'm sorry, world tier 3 to world tier 4. You have to do the capstone dungeon, and then the second modifier there is Growling Cry generates 20 Fury and grants an additional 20% resource generation. Again, build is built off a very resource heavy skill. And when we get to the end of the build, you'll see why this is so significant. Here we have Imposing Presence, gains 15% additional maximum life. Always good to have more life, because if you lose it all, you die. This is something I've not seen on a lot of builds. You just need this outburst skill to get this next one, Tough as Nails, which increases your thorns by 3%. I personally like thorns. I think it helps with weaker enemies where I'm not just trying to, basically play whack-a-mole. They kind of kill themselves sometimes. But the second part of this, when enemies hit you, they take an additional 10% of your thorns as bleed over 5 seconds. So this is important because when you start looking at substats on some of the items, you'll see that there is damage to bleed enemies. This is not a bleed build, so this is just like a passive way to be able to do more damage. So we'll move down here to the brawling skills. First and foremost, we have War Cry. You know, increases your damage dealt by 19.5%. Now I only actually put 1 point in here. I do have an item that gives me 3 additional points. So My stats are a little higher, and then the modifiers I have on this are War Cry, grants you Berserking for 5 seconds. Berserking, as it tells you here at the bottom, says grants 25% increased damage and 15% increased movement speed. This effect lasts up to 5 seconds. You'll see when I go over the gear that I have quite a few items that have additional damage while berserking, or berserking lasts longer. No, these are really good for endgame so that you're hitting harder. Then the second modifier here, if at least 6 enemies are near you when you cast Warcry, damage bonuses increase by an additional 10%. I like this for the simple fact that with the new patch that just dropped, the monster density does seem to be a little bit better. It's not everywhere. It could definitely be improved, but I've been benefiting from this more since the patch. Moving on, we have Booming Voice. Your shout skill will last 25% longer. This is great because this is a bonus to damage, and this other one over here is a bonus to source generation. And so this should benefit both of them. Raid leader, I dropped 3 points in here so that I could heal my friends when I use this. If you're a solo player, you probably don't need these 3 here. You could choose something else on this tree. And then next we have aggressive resistance, gain 9% damage reduction while berserking. This goes to what I was saying earlier. There's a lot of benefits that are going on when you're berserking as a barbarian. Damage reduction. I don't think I mentioned that before, but 9% damage reduction while you're pushing end game content is definitely beneficial. And then while berserking, fear generation is increased by 18%. Weapon mastery skills. You'll see I have 4 points on death blow. This is all from item contribution. I don't really use this in my main build, but if I do see an enemy that's like almost dead, not like an elite, it's like a regular enemy, I'll just use this. It's on my skill bar, but not necessary. But what is necessary, in my opinion, Pit Fighter, 9% increased damage to close enemies and gain 6% distant damage reduction. I found that this has helped me a lot when I am swarmed with melee units, and then there's a bunch of ranged enemies, and then and in addition, no mercy. You have 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. Earlier on in the build, you saw that we were choosing things that would stun enemies as you did damage to them. There's another glyph that we have for the items, or I have rather, that also will spread these crowd control effects to nearby enemies, or there's a percent to do that, and we'll go over that later. So this could be, you know, extremely beneficial if you get that to proc and stun enemies, and then you drop your hammer of the game. Good way to do damage there. Down here we have thick skinned. Time you take direct damage, you get 1% base life as fortify. You'll see later that being fortified is built into the items that I have, and even though we're not going to go over the Paragon board, I have some points for damage reduction while fortified. Just a really good defensive thing to focus on, in my opinion. And then counter offensive while fortified, for over 50% of your maximum life, you deal 12 damage. Another benefit damage from here. Next, we have the ultimate skill, Wrath of the Berserker. Given, I think this is in just about every barbarian build, just for the simple fact that when you do knock the enemies back, you do gain berserking and unstoppable for 5 seconds. So it's like another way to break CC, but additionally, you go straight into berserking, and it lasts 5 seconds. And then for the next 10 seconds, dealing direct damage with basic skills, grants berserking for. So you can just extend the length of your berserking. And as we saw previously, we had the damage bonus. I think Fury regeneration built in to the build for when you are berserk. So pop this, and you just kind of can go to town. The modifiers we have for it So when Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increase damage bonus by 25%. Again, just making you hit harder. Then the second modifier, while Wrath of the Berserker is active, gain an additional 20% increase movement speed and Fury generation by 30%. So not only can you run around and hit the enemies faster, you have the built-in Fury generation here. Just want to reiterate just how heavy how resource heavy this build is, and this additional generation makes it so that you can actually use Hammer of the Ancients. Tempered Fury increases your maximum Fury by 9. You'll see why this is later. And then heals for 9% of your maximum life, 100 Fury spent. And this has saved my life more times than I can count. And then lastly, the key passive. It says vital drive vital synergies through unique interactions. The one we are choosing, core skills, 135% increased damage, but cost 100% more fury. This is the Hammer of the Ancients skill. It is a core, so this is going to just make it hit harder. And that's it for the actual skill tree on them. So let's into items that we have equipped and some of the glyphs that are being. So for the helm, I don't have any uniques. I don't have any like best in slot, but this is the helm I have. I've got some cooldown reduction. This helps with the shouts, all stats. Just that's in my opinion, extremely beneficial with some of the things on the Paragon board. Basic skill attack speed. You'll see that throughout some of my items, I do have attack speed built in, just for the simple fact that a two-handed bludgeoning weapon does have a 0.9 max per second. It's very slow. I, if I'm not mistaken, it's probably the slowest in the game, if not close. And so having just a touch of attack speed can make all the difference for if you're resource starved or if you just, really just need to out some damage. And then you'll see this is where the ranks of death blow are. I'm debating on rolling that off or something else. Just don't have the materials for it. And then the glyph that I chose is becoming injured. While crowd controlled grants you unstoppable seconds. This effect has a 20-second cooldown. You'll see the better roll on this would be closer to 20. And then I chose the maximum life just as a kind of utility slot for this item. This is the piece of armor that I have. You'll see I have thorns on it. Again, I do like thorns in my build just a little bit. It's not a thorns build, so to speak, but it does help with some smaller enemies. Here is where you'll see some damage reduction while fortified. Very beneficial for a melee use. I think that rolled pretty well there. Maximum life, obviously, a melee user just going to be in the fray. Not a whole lot you can do, but more life is always better. A pretty decent roll there. All stats, again, I think that is just a good thing to have on various pieces of armor. The glyph I have is gain 0.25% increased armor for 4 seconds while you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 20%. It's more of a defensive glyph, any extra bonus to defense while you're pushing some of those stronger enemies. The gem I have here, or gems I should say, 3% damage reduction while fortified, and 250 thorns. Again, you like a little bit of thorn. And moving on to gloves, you'll see this has 45% overpower damage. Not really sure how I feel about that, but I think it's fine. I do see that overpower happens relatively often, so I feel like that's a bonus. You'll see there is +3 ranks of Hammer of the Ancients. Also, this just builds onto the Hammer of the Ancients skill damage, and so I don't know when I will actually get rid of this piece of gear. You can see it's 10 level lower than my actual character, simply for the fact that I don't want to give up the extra damage. I did roll attack speed on this, going back to just having a little attack speed into the build so that I'm not resource. I could have rolled differently on the ranks of Rend. Don't use Rend. That's not really a benefit to me. And then I put the with 23% increased damage while we have barrier active. One, we have pants. Again, haven't found anything better yet. Damage reduction from enemies. Being a barbarian, you're always in fray. I think this is huge. 18 stats again. Don't have to reiterate. There's some more thorns for the build, and then Warcry is the one that gives us the glyph that we have on it is basic skills grant 20% damage reduction and then moving on, low duration reduction. Not the worst thing that could have rolled here, but definitely could have better. 15% movement speed after, again, could have rolled better, but not the worst thing. Fury cost reduction. We are a very heavy build. This helps with that. 42 strength, being a barbarian, that's our main stat. And then the have here is you hit a crowd controlled enemy, there's up to a 4% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. So this is what I was talking about earlier. When you stun somebody, that has a chance to stun other. I find that to be beneficial. Expand to the weapons here next. First, we'll start with Amulet here. This has all elements. I'm pretty sure that's standard on all amulets. Flow duration reduction. Here is where I was speaking about the berserking duration lasting long. My math is right. Take the base 5 seconds. 27% like another second. Critical strike chance. I'm sorry. Critical strike chance against enemies. Injured, I believe, is like when they're under 35% life. I find this to be really useful during boss fights to get under or into that injured range. I tend to just kind of like shred through. Overpowered damage with two-handed blade weapons. Probably could have rolled something differently, but this is okay for right now. And then glyph, damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier absorb up to 4,001. Can only happen once every 30 seconds. Barrier has probably saved my life more times than especially when you go to World Tier 4. With the increased monster density, I've had it to where I've had like mobs kind of swarming me, so I'll hit the barrier. Sometimes they'll shred right through the barrier, other times they don't. That is, in my opinion, the best defensive that you can have. Going to my first ring, resistances, critical strike chance. Can't ever have too much of that. Maximum fury. This will be important, or this is important because Hammer of the Ancients deals damage based off the total amount of fury that you have when using it. So once your max is 120 and you're at 120 and you use it, it'll do extra damage. Flavor generation, while not damaged recently, probably could have rolled something different. I'm getting hit a lot, doesn't benefit me a ton. Damage to injured enemies. Then when you deal direct damage while berserking, like 20% of the damage as bleed over. Now the bleed is not the important bit here. It's the doing bonus damage to bleed that we've seen on some of the other pieces. That just makes it so that they can take more damage kind of passively. So, and then for the gem, 200, the skull, 250 armor. The second ring, 10.5% barrier, just makes it so when I have a barrier, it generates more. Damage to injured enemies, damage to stunned enemies, both great for this build. And then resource generation is 17.7%, just helping keep that fury coming so we can use Hammer of the Ancient often. And then here, killing an enemy with core skill, which is what Hammer of the Ancient is, refunds 10% of its base fury. Beyond a weapon that I have, 55.5% basic damage, not super important, but good to have for some of the smaller enemies. 171 strength, 63% damage to close enemies, always up in people's faces when attacking them. Can't go wrong with those. Damage to crowd controlled enemies. We are stunning people, so this just helps. The glyph. Now, this is what I think makes this build is Hammer of the Ancients quakes outward a percentage of its damage to enemies. Now, this is one of those glyphs that on anything else would just be pretty sure in this instance it would be 40%, but since it's on a two-handed weapon, it gives like another 100%, so it's now 80% instead of 40. And I think this is really what makes this build because as you're stacking damage for just that impact area, this is going to quake outward, doing more damage. The 2 gems on here, 12% critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies. Other two-handed weapon we have here, overpower damage, ultimate skill damage. Probably going to roll that off because my ultimate skill doesn't actually do damage to enemies. So probably roll that off. We have critical strike damage, almost 50% more, which is great. Damage to injured enemies, and that's great. And then the the aspect we have here is basic skills gain 30%. Now, this is one of our main sources of fury generation. Having that attack faster will allow us to generate more. One of the one-handed weapons I have, damage while berserking, vulnerable damage. Damage here is that damage to bleed enemies. Another night, an attacking enemy with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 10% up to 30%. So basically, use your basic skill 3 times, and then you get a 30% bonus Hammer of the Ancients. You can probably tell that this is just building, so your Hammer of the Ancients should be getting pretty good. Gem critical strike damage to and my other one-handed weapon, damage to bleed enemies again, along with strength, then damage while berserk. Then lastly, damage on enemies. These are all great. Probably could have rolled higher on the damage to bleed. Overall, pretty good. The aspect I have on here, probably gonna switch it, or I am gonna switch it out for Edge Master's aspect. Skills deal up to 10% increased damage based on your available primary resource to receive maximum benefit while you have full primary resource. I don't have items to do this yet, but when I do, this is just going to give us that much more damage. And then lastly, the potion or the elixir that I like to use. Well, there's a couple here. So you can use resource cost, reduces resource cost by 20% is an option. I don't feel like I have a ton of issues with resources to use this all the time. Here increases maximum resources by 50. I did use one of these just to test it out. It can hit pretty hard, so I think this is a good choice. Overpower damage. This one I was told to try out. Not really sure how I feel about it at the moment. And then the one I really like increases attack speed by 13%. This really makes it so I don't have any resource issues. They are a little more challenging to farm than some of the other elixirs, but I personally think that I like this one better, or I'm sorry, the best for this build. Yeah, so when you bring all of that together, you have minimal issues, I think, with resource generation. Attack bonuses built on top of each other makes you hit pretty hard. Oh, and then as a barbarian, you get this expertise tab. I'm running a two-handed mace, so I get this bonus percent chance to gain 2 fury, and then double the amount of fury gained while berserking. So again, berserking is just giving us another added benefit to our fury generation. My second two-handed weapon is a sword, so 20% of direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleed over 5 seconds. Again, the bleed is not the star of the show here. It's the fact that bleeding enemies take more damage. And then under the technique slot, I chose two-handed axe, which gives an additional 15% damage to vulnerable enemies. Another way to hit just a little bit harder. And that is the build. If you have any questions or comments, leave a comment in the comments section below, and then we will see you next time.